good afternoon and welcome to the Clean Energy Transition Institute's Decarbonization Forum, Addressing Aviation Climate Impacts. My name is Eileen Quigley and I'm the Executive Director of the Clean Energy Transition Institute, which is also known as CETI. On behalf of CETI's board and staff, I welcome you here this afternoon to join us in this important conversation about sustainable aviation in the Northwest. Here's our agenda. We will start with opening remarks from Senator Maria Cantwell, a longtime champion for the environment in general and relevant to today's program for cutting emissions in the aviation sector. We will then hear from 12 experts in sustainable aviation across 2 panels. The first panel will explore near and midterm solutions that have the best potential to address aviation's climate challenges in the Northwest. The second panel will focus on one of those solutions, sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. Please scan the QR code on the tent card in front of you to access the virtual event pamphlet with full bios for all of our speakers. You also should have received this in email in advance of the event. Our goal is to have fruitful discussions with a what will it take approach to achieve aviation industry's climate goals. We aim to capitalize on our regional history of collaboration and leadership in the aviation sector to scale regional sustainable aviation solutions. We hope you'll remain after the panels for reception in the lobby. And let's see, housekeeping. So the easiest way to get to the ladies' room is to exit through the back and go straight down the hall, and you'll see a sign that says women's room. The code is taped above the keypad. For the men's room, you exit the front of the room and then you head towards the reception desk, and it's the first door on the left and there's no code. If you have to leave early, and in fact, when you leave, we'd be grateful if you could please drop your name tags off at the desk where you checked in. First, I want to thank our host, K&L Gates, for graciously sharing this lovely space with us today and for providing the technology that is filming this forum so we can disseminate it far and wide. I also want to acknowledge and thank CETI's stellar board of directors, Liz Thomas, Rob Davis. Rob, you want to raise your hand? John McGarry, Ross McFarlane, Crystal Ball, Mariah Kennedy, Kathleen Hebert, and our newest elected board member as of this past Monday, Glenn Blackman. He recently stepped down at the end of 2025 as director of the Washington State Department of Commerce's Energy Policy Division. In particular, I want to express my deep gratitude to Ross McFarlane, a founding CETI board member who has been working on this event since last August when my team and I first pitched him the idea of a panel on sustainable aviation. Ross has been working on sustainable aviation for many decades, and we are ever so lucky to have had his guidance and engagement over the past 6 months. We're also fortunate that many of our donors and funders are here today. The stars that you see on their name tags indicate they are a CETI donor. CETI would not be here if not for their generous support. So I ask you to join me in applauding all of our donors. Fabulous. Finally, I want to acknowledge my team, Research Director, Dr. Stacia Dreyer, and Operations and Communications Director, Jamie Potasek, Research Analyst, Ruby Moore, and Jean Curry. We definitely would not all be here today if not for Jamie, who has handled every single detail from start to finish, and Ruby, who's the primary author of the 101 document in front of you, and who will moderate our first panel. So huge thanks to them. For those of you who are not familiar with the Clean Energy Transition Institute, we are an independent, nonpartisan research and analysis nonprofit organization. Our mission is to accelerate an equitable clean energy transition in the Northwest. We provide unbiased research and analytics. We frame, translate, and demystify complex decarbonization solutions, and we convene partners and decision makers to have fact-based conversations about how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the Northwest. Our decarbonization forums explore challenges in the transition from fossil to clean energy. In the past, we've explored topics including emissions accounting and data center energy use, This year, in addition to today's forum, we will also present a forum on building decarbonization and behavioral science, as well as one on carbon dioxide removal. And we're also looking at one on expanding Western transmission. As part of our decarbonization forums, we produce these 101 documents, like the ones that some of you are leafing through. These backgrounders unpack the complexity of the topic that we explore at each forum. Please take this 101 document with you, and it's also available online. With that, it is my honor to introduce video remarks from Senator Maria Cantwell, who has represented our state in the U.S. Senate since she won that squeaker of an election back in 2000. She is a leading voice on aviation safety and now has 7 years under her belt as the top Democrat on the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, which oversees the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. Senator Cantwell also serves on the Senate Finance, Energy, Natural Resources, Indian Affairs, and Small Business Committees. A longtime champion of cutting aviation emissions, she authored multiple sustainable aviation initiatives in the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, including the FAA programs to expand sustainable aviation fuel supply chains and advance low-emission aviation technologies. Senator Cantwell also led the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024, securing historic increases in FAA research to promote U.S. leadership in sustainable and innovative aerospace technologies and investments in Washington's world-class aviation workforce. The Senator is hard at work back in the other Washington and was sorry she couldn't join us today, but she recorded this video to kick off our event.
Thank you, and especially thank you, Eileen, for your great leadership in continuing to write about the clean energy economy and how it needs to continue to work for us moving forward. I also want to thank you for that kind introduction and to thank you and the Clean Energy Transition Institute for conveying this important summit. I wish I could be there in person, but I certainly appreciate everybody who was there this morning's commitment to building the partnerships and solutions needed to decarbonize aviation here in the Pacific Northwest. Washington State, as we all know, is a leader in aviation and aerospace innovation. Aerospace alone is a $71 billion industry in our state, and it directly employs over 194,000 people. That, if you put a multiplier out there, also covers about 250,000 jobs. So a big part of the Washington economy. These jobs and economic benefits matter, and they mean that we need to do everything we can to protect an aviation future that is more sustainable. Today, aviation accounts for roughly 2.5% of our global carbon emissions. So without action, the growing demand for air travel, and we do see worldwide demand increasing in huge numbers, that air travel could triple the aviation's carbon footprint by 2050. That is why it is so important for us to continue our work together. I'm working here in Washington, D.C. on a next-generation aviation tech hub for next-generation composite materials that would continue to make us in our region the leaders in lighter-weight, fuel-efficient planes. So we also need to focus, though, on aviation in the sustainable flight path, particularly sustainable aviation fuel and other technologies that reduce or eliminate emissions. The good news is Washington is well poised to take on these challenges. We are exceptionally well positioned in our state because we're already a leader in advanced aerospace materials and next generation aircraft technologies. We have a strong foundation in sustainable aviation fuel and the aviation supply chain that goes along with that. Sustainable aviation fuels can significantly, we know, reduce the life cycle of greenhouse gases and emissions and reduce the contrail impacts, which can increase the overall warming effects. What makes Washington unique, though, is that our diversity of sustainable aviation fuel opportunities, from waste streams to captured carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and renewable natural gas. So Washington can try it all. We have existing infrastructure with companies like BP at Cherry Point and Blaine, REG facilities on the renewable energies in Grays Harbor. And combined with state level incentives, federal support has helped make Washington a very attractive place for innovators to continue to invest in sustainable aviation fuel. Federal leadership and regional collaboration are going to be critical to scaling these solutions. So I was very encouraged to see the Washington leaders come together and launch the Cascadia Sustainable Aviation Fuel Accelerator. This is to spur regional investment in collaboration in sustainable aviation fuel. And sustainable aviation is not just a climate strategy, it's an important economic strategy for creating high-wage jobs that strengthen our local communities. This is why I authored a key provision in the Inflation Reduction Act and also included FAA programs to build sustainable aviation fuel supply chains, to advance lower emission aviation technologies, and to establish the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Blender Credit. We modeled these on other fuel programs, particularly on biofuels that we had done in the past. These programs have supported projects including enabling sustainable aviation fuel production at Cherry Point, Help Zero Avia's hydrogen electric engines in Everett, and Boeing's commercial aircraft sustainable aviation fuel model, and also ApiJet's sustainable flight path technologies in Seattle. So we would say these tax credits are working and we need to continue to make investments in them. We also secured a historic increase in the FAA's research funding through 2024. That's part of the FAA reauthorization bill. This is when we were the chair of the Commerce Committee, and it included funding for Washington State University's critical work at Accent. This is a program that supports innovation and competitiveness in aviation and continuing to drive change and advancements. But having said all that about the work our region is doing and how we're well poised, talking about the tax credits, talking about the continued investment by FAA, we know that real change still remains. We know there are some here in Washington, D.C. that would like to roll back clean energy programs and weaken sustainable aviation incentives, and that would threaten our progress. So we all need to work together, whether that's at DOD or Department of Ag or FAA or in the Finance Committee. We all need to work together. We also need Washington's leadership at home, even more importantly, to communicate how much progress we are really making and why, just as you have outlined this morning, in how much demand for aviation is going to increase and thereby carbon production increasing, we all have to invest now. Failing to invest now will allow others to capture this market. Working together collaboratively, I believe that Washington can continue to lead in this very competitive race for the future of aerospace. So again, let me thank all of you for working together collaboratively to address this issue this morning by focusing specifically on aviation. Let me also thank everybody who continues to collaborate on these efforts in our state and work together to not only define the problem, but to accept the challenge and bring about these important solutions. I know Washington will continue to lead in sustainable aviation fuel and that it will be an era of great progress. Thank you all for inviting me to speak this morning.
Okay, we will now kick off the live program with our first panel moderated by Ruby Moore Bloom.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Ruby Moore Bloom. I'm a research analyst at CETI and really excited to dive into this conversation. So I will invite panel one to come up here, just take a seat behind your name. And as you're doing that, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to what we'll be talking about. So as Eileen mentioned, you can find full bios in the using the QR codes at your table. I will just briefly introduce folks. We are very, very lucky to be joined. Are the name tags wrong? The double Lauren issue. Okay, thank you for fixing that. We are very lucky to be joined by 6 experts up here to share their perspectives on near and midterm solutions that have the best potential to scale and address aviation's climate impacts here in the Northwest. And when I say climate impacts, we are talking about greenhouse gases, but we're also talking about non-CO2 emissions and short-lived climate pollutants. So you'll hear a little bit more about that from some of our panelists. And when I say solutions, we're talking about everything from sustainable aviation fuels, which we'll hear a lot more about in the second panel, to operational efficiency, contrail avoidance, and other emission reduction technology. Each panelist will give us a brief presentation, and then we'll move into Q&A. So Ryan Faucett will kick us off. Ryan is the Vice President of Global Sustainability and Engagement and Partnerships at Boeing, where he leads a global team focused on supporting airline sustainability priorities and informing the global and regional policy landscape. We will then hear from Nick Pavlenko, the Director of Fuels and Aviation Programs at the International Council on Clean Transportation, ICCT, and he will share some findings from a recent ICCT report. Next up, we have Michael Wolcott, Regents Professor at the Washington State University, who specializes in sustainable fuels and materials. And Michael also serves as the director of Ascent, a 16-university center of excellence that conducts research to inform the Federal Aviation Administration's decision-making in national and international forums. We will then move to Jason Humphrey, an associate with RMI's Climate Aligned Industries program on the aviation team, and we'll share some of what RMI is working on to accelerate net zero aviation. And then we will hear from Stephanie Meyn, Climate Program Manager for Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, who will share how the region's largest airport is thinking about climate solutions for aviation. And finally, we will learn from Lauren Hogrewe, Senior Energy Policy Specialist with the Washington State Department of Commerce, about the role that commerce and state government can play in navigating these questions. So with that, Ryan, I will give you, I will actually pass this down, a clicker to advance the slides, and we will get started.
Thank you. Okay. First I'm gonna do audio check. Can everyone hear me? We're using these are really fancy wireless things here. This is great. What a setting. Delighted to be here with you all, and thank you, Ruby, and thanks to the CETI for having us. This is a really important convening, and I just know from who's here, we're gonna have the right type of discussion here today. So thank you for having us. I'm going to set the table a little bit from an industry perspective, but also a Boeing perspective. Being the first panel and the first up, I thought that would be most appropriate. So we're going to start from broad to narrow. For us, it starts here. This isn't news for anybody, but if you're kind of tracking where the game is headed, there's a lot of other industries out there that are making a lot of progress. Aviation is not making as much progress. So this 2.5% is likely to grow. I've seen ranges from 5% by 2030 to even 10 or 15% by 2035 or 20% by 2050 if we don't make progress. And so this is our North Star. It continues to be. And the reason for that for Boeing is this is market risk. Okay, so it's decarbonization, but for us, it's market risk. We see demand effects if we don't bend this curve from a market perspective, and our ability to compete within that to sell new airplanes is part of that story. For us, it's a 5-part strategy. It starts with our airplanes, fleet renewal. This is the biggest near-term lever the industry has for decarbonizing. It's now, it's immediate, and every time we build and deliver a brand new Boeing aircraft, we're making a difference on the climate picture and on decarbonization. I'll just give one stat. Every time we deliver a 737 MAX aircraft and it replaces an older model, that's taking 8 million pounds of CO2 out of the equation per airplane per year. And if you add that up, and I'll do a SAF calculation here, because we're going to talk about SAF today. The equivalent of one airplane is, over the course of a year, about 500,000 gallons of SAF at an 80% CI. So if we deliver 500 MAX airplanes this year, that is something like 250 million gallons of SAF equivalent that we've put into the system. So airplane efficiency is real, and it's a huge lever, and we're doing our best to produce those airplanes. We're on a nice path now, and I think you're going to see good news out of Boeing this year on that. Operational efficiency, we continue to hunt the low-hanging fruit that this provides the industry. We've got a lot of solutions on our side, but the industry does as well, and this is the ultimate kind of team sport to get the 1%, 2% opportunities that exist now over the next 5 to 10 years. Renewable energy, SAF is the main part of that, but that's not the only story contained within that. We think about it holistically, although SAF continues to be our most important lever on renewable energy. Advanced technology, Boeing continues to invest in new technology platforms and capabilities. We've got a program with NASA. We're looking at a long, thin, truss-braced wing concept, potentially applicable for some of our future airplane programs. So again, after the efficiency gains that provides, we continue to study hydrogen, although to be very clear on hydrogen, we see that as a next technology. Not something that's going to on-ramp anytime soon due to the complexities of the infrastructure and also the creation of a safe and certifiable platform around hydrogen propulsion. Market-based measures is the last lever for us, and we continue to be active there, supporting CORSIA and enabling quality market-based carbon removal solutions. So the cool thing about this strategy is everybody can participate in it. We're going to talk about all these levers today. One thing I wanted to mention, though, is we've also got a new tool out there. Some of you may already know about it. It's called Cascade. I'm going to show a short video to introduce this, and then make sure to write it down, because everybody can access Cascade for free today. So pay attention. All right, quick video. Thank you. Okay, so Cascade is like the ultimate choose your own adventure for all the stuff that we're talking about, all right? So you can get into the tool and you can create your own scenarios at a very detailed level. You could talk feedstock, you could talk about the different operational efficiency items. You can do different areas of the world, different fleet mixes. The capabilities are truly astounding, and we're coming out with 3.0 this year, which will include abatement cost analysis work in there as well. So we can start making economic trades, which is really, I think we'll end up talking a lot about that today. So get into Cascade. We can talk more about this, and come find me if you want a personal demo. I'd be happy to take you through it. So I'm going to leave it here.
All right, quick sound check. Does this work okay? Great. So it's a real privilege to be here. It's tough to follow up Cascade, but I'll do my best.
No competition.
I'm the director of the Aviation Fuel Programs at the ICCT, and we're an independent nonprofit research organization that studies the decarbonization of the transport sector and the policies and technologies necessary to do it. And so we recently prepared a global inventory of aviation emissions and some scenarios of decarbonization pathways out to 2050. Now, while I can't get into all the details today, I thought I could bring up a few of the potential contributions of the technologies so we could discuss their roles when they come into play, impact they make, and we could kind of let that marinate a bit and then get back to it in the Q&A in the discussion at the reception. So before we get into the analysis, I thought it's kind of important to do just a bit of fundamentals about climate change. Hopefully, if you're in this room, CO2 is something you're familiar with, right? Every unit of it that you emit doesn't warm the climate that much, but it accumulates. It stays in the atmosphere for many, many, many years and warms it over time. And even if we went to net zero tomorrow, the CO2 in the atmosphere would persist. It would continue to warm it, though you could make a dent into future warming by going to net zero. But there's another category of pollutants called short-lived climate pollutants, like black carbon, water vapor, persistent contrails, that also warm the climate, but they don't persist. Nevertheless, they're very, very powerful and can warm the climate quite quickly. And so if you can reduce these emissions, you can generate substantial near-term reductions in climate warming. And so aviation releases both types of pollutants. So the research question then is very straightforward. How can we cut short-lived climate pollutants to reduce emissions from aviation and put it in line with the Paris Agreement and the 1.7 degree warming budget? So while the question is straightforward, the answer really isn't. The process of getting to that answer isn't. We developed an inventory based on real-world trajectories assembled by Spire. So real-world flight data, you combine it with performance characteristics for airplanes, engines, emission factors for all of them. You can then develop an inventory of real-world emissions from the bottom up for CO2 and non-CO2 pollutants. And the real cool thing about this inventory is that it's not just distances, it's trajectories. And so when you have the trajectories, you can run them through a contrail model and figure out when and where trajectories pass through the colder, moister regions of the atmosphere that lead to persistent contrail formation. And you can assemble a contrail inventory as well. And so when we put that into a climate model, we use a simplified one called FAIR, you can get an estimate of the warming from the conventional pollutants we're all familiar with, but also these SLCPs, and develop an inventory based on warming and do scenarios out to 2050, looking at how you can affect future warming based on the actions you take. And so this figure is one we're really excited about that shows the warming as a snapshot in time from contrails in 2023. You can see this is based on routes. You can see what routes are generating the strongest contrail impact. You can see it's really clustered over the US, the North Atlantic, over the EU. And so here's some of that information in a slightly different format. Here you can see the total contribution of warming from aviation to the climate, 1940 to the present day. There's CO2, of course, but that other big blue bar, contrails, is on a similar scale, though with large error bars. So contrails as SLCPs are warming the climate as much as that accumulated historical total of CO2. But when we have the route-based inventory, we can see what's contributing to this contrail formation. It turns out that just a handful of flights are generating a lot of this warming. And if we can reroute them, if we can reduce this contrail warming, you can put a big dent in overall aviation warming. So building out our scenarios to 2050, we looked at a few different mitigation levers. So there's the ones you're probably really familiar with: fuel efficiency, operational efficiency, SAFs, zero emission planes in the later years. But there's also some SLCP reduction strategies that we included as well. So lean burn engines, contrail rerouting, reduced aromatic fuels, whether by hydrotreating fossil fuels or blending SAFs. And so then we get into the scenarios and the results. So this is kind of a more conventional view of greenhouse gas emissions over time on the right-hand side. And on the left, you see the jet share of, or the fossil jet share of the mix. The historical trends are that brown bar at the top. Emissions are projected to just about double compared to the present day, barely any SAFs, if any. Orange is current commitments. That's mostly the SAF mandates in the EU, UK, and a few smaller Asian countries. And orange, or yellow, excuse me, is the GHG forward trend with strong SAF mandates modeled on the EU for the whole world. And then blue is SLCP forward. So strategies that reduce SLCP warming. So contrail rerouting, hydrotreating, fossil jet. And green is that scenario where you put it all together and you combine the GHG forward strategy with the SLCP forward strategy. And you get about halving of conventional greenhouse gas emissions here compared to the other scenarios. Now, current commitments for reference is still about a 60% increase versus the present day. And so here's what it looks like when you put it all together. This is a bit of a different type of chart. This is aviation's past and future contribution to warming. And so here you can see that our historical trends put us on track to double aviation warming. Current commitments reduce that a little bit. If you have a GHG forward strategy going to 70% SAF by 2050, very aggressive, you just about have future warming. But the SLCP forward strategy makes a bigger dent. That's about a 75% reduction in future warming. But when you get to combine both of them, SAF's GHG reduction technologies like efficiency and SLCP reductions, you get to climate stabilization by 2050. And I think that's really exciting because this is a world in which aviation traffic demand is increasing by about 150%. But it shows you that with the right application of technologies and strategies, you can get to climate neutral growth. So happy to talk about it more in the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much. Great, thank you. So you're going to see a lot of the same type of material in my talk too, and I think you're going to see a lot of that today. But what's really amazing in this is that there is a common vision for how we go forward. Maybe what the role of different components might be. One might be a little higher or less, but I think it should be encouraging to see that there's a lot of the same vision going forward, whether you're in academia, whether you're in an environmental NGO, whether you're in the industry itself and that, and you'll see a little bit of differences as we go forward. What I want to concentrate on today was looking at these three components of aircraft technology, operational improvements, and this says SAF. This comes out of actually ICAO materials, but you can also view it as just energy systems as a whole in this. One of the things I want you to sort of take home from this is that if you look at flights, so this is a sort of cumulative totals on one side with flight distances on another side, and so on the top, if you look at sort of the flights that are less than 50 nautical miles, they represent about 50% of operations, but it's only 15% of fuel use. So although there's a lot of flights in that sort of area, it doesn't have a huge contribution to the CO2 emissions in comparison to the long haul flights that are over 1,000 nautical miles. That's only 20% of operations. But it's 65% of the total fuel burn within there. And so what's really important is as we develop solutions, those solutions have to be scalable to dual aisle aircraft and long distance travel. So we're seeing a lot of things proposed that may be on more regional jets, and that's an important stepping stone for us to be able to mature technologies. But what we need today is we need these solutions that scale towards larger planes and long flights. The operational component to that, and Ryan talked about taking operational components, for efficiencies and routing and things along that line, and that's where a lot of the efforts has taken place. When Akib talked about, so the role of contrails in this, and being able to avoid this in terms of patches is really important. And it's not just a whole different routing, but basically routing in terms of changes of elevation and horizontal routing. And one of the things that the research in ascent is showing is that elevation changes may be a larger role within that. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done on our air traffic control to allow pilot decisions, to allow, sort of vertical changes and things along that line. These contrail formation is really important because, as was already mentioned, the half-life of a CO2 molecule is 100 years in the atmosphere. 100 years. So a change we make now is going to affect our grandchildren. But if we avoid a contrail, which is about 50% of the global warming potential, we turn it off today. And so that's a really important piece that was already, sort of noted within there. And so working on these operational stuff, air traffic controllers, understanding the science of contrail formation, understanding what role SAF and particulates has in terms of reduction of that is a really, really important factor to this. Technology improvements, and Ryan already, talked about sort of this aspect, but this is another, this ATAG waypoint 2050 chart that's in there. It's this wedge chart in here, but in that top sort of dashed line is, if we take the efficiency of aircraft at 1990, which, I don't know, to me, Ross, maybe to you too, it doesn't seem that long ago, right? But if you look at that in 1990 and you take and project that efficiency over all the flights that we see in this, you can see what magnitude aircraft technology has had with this. But there's only so much power reductions you can have and improvements in being able to burn at higher temperatures by materials and so on and so forth. So that's going to come to diminishing levels unless we really change planes for this. One opportunity is through this demonstrator that's been paused right now by NASA Boeing demonstrator, the X-66, that really looks at a radically different sort of aircraft and truss brace, different wings. Things along this line might result in 30% reduction, but we're going to have to do radical changes in the aircraft design in order to continue to see a strong part to that. So while technology improvements have made enormous opportunities, and fleet renewal is a continuing important type of aspect, we're going to have to look at different aircraft in order to keep that trajectory up in that area. And then this is a chart actually I stole from Jim Heilman, who's now at Boeing, is the counterpart on more the engineering side of things with Ryan. I was joking with somebody today. I used to report to him in the FAA and directing ascent. I feel like I still work for him. He constantly is doing this, but this is a really good system of this, is to understand that energy systems in an airport and in aviation is a systems of systems problem. So we're not just going to produce SAF and have everything fine, that this is actually going to have to change. It could change combustions and engines, infrastructure to blend and convey these aspects, and what the exact sort of feedstock and carrier or conversion technology needs to be. So this is a very complex problem associated with it. If we look at actually changing fuel energy system itself to go to hydrogen and electricity, there's going to be dramatically more complexity to go forward with this. So it's very important to work on all of these solutions, but what's important is not to forget all the issues and steps along the way for that. And the complexity of this system is really sort of held forth in this one chart. I actually just got this morning, and Ruby was nice enough to let me substitute a slide in. One of my researchers on work that we're doing sort of showed it to me. But what this is we track all announcements and plans for building of facilities, and have a whole way of projecting sort of how much capacity we expect to come in here. So in 2025, the expected capacity that we should have in terms of being able to produce SAF is that is the green bars associated with this. But the dashed lines and the is out how much is actually being sold today into the marketplace for there. So while we have abilities to build plants and capacities, we haven't been able to activate that production very well. We're down to a fraction of that level. So if we're going to be able to expand this to see and realize the actual capacity, we're really going to have to activate and take away from this barriers to the industry going forward in this. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. And hold on to that capacity versus reality thing, because I actually, it'll be a good follow-up for them. So good to see everyone. My name is Jason Humphrey from RMI. I'm on the aviation team. Thank you to CETI. Just quick, are the slides going to be available after to everyone? Okay, great. Because my caveat was I was a little ambitious with what I wanted to share with everyone. So if you just bear with me, I'm going to kind of like say, focus on this slide and then kind of move on and not really give time to really give each slide its due, just because there's a lot I wanted to share. So yeah, sounding a lot like what Eileen was saying, RMI is another global independent nonprofit that works to accelerate the clean energy transition. And specifically on my team, the aviation team, we have 4 main branches. I personally sit on the supply side there at the top. So we collaborate with SAF producers. So we've directly collaborated in consulting engagements with over 10 producers, both in the US and internationally. We also have a demand team focused on SAF-C, which is where our Buyers Alliance, the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance called SABA sits, as well as our SAF-C registry, which we collaborate a lot with the Center for Green Market Activation, as well as EDF. And then at the bottom there, we have Contrails, which you were hearing about before. We convened the Contrail Impact Task Force, and then also a new initiative we have called Net Zero Airports, which I'll mention briefly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about SAF. I know we have a full panel on SAF later, but that is mostly what I work on, so it's what I'm most qualified to talk to you about today. So the purpose of this slide, as I was saying, the purpose of this slide is skipping past, why is SAF important? What makes it unique? The way I like to think about it is, why would someone buy SAF? Well, there's basically 2 answers to that question. The first is because they have to, and the second is because they want to. So on the left, they have to in certain cases because they're mandated. So here we have the EU mandate, but we're also seeing the mandate in the UK and other mandates coming on in Asia Pacific with places like Japan and Singapore following that strategy. But we don't see that strategy sort of likely to come up here in the US. So that's where we get to the right side of the slide, which is the voluntary market. And the voluntary market is essentially born out of this overlap between the scope 1, which is the direct emissions of airlines, and then the scope 3, which is the business travel or corporate emissions of corporate customers, which often look something like consulting firms, big banks, perhaps people in healthcare, people who have outsized scope 3 and are really motivated to tackle that problem with in-sector reductions. So the value of that SAF certificate is half of the equation that helps you close this gap between SAF's total costs, which, as was mentioned earlier, is much more expensive than conventional jet fuel. And then the other half of that is incentives. And when you stack those 2 things on top of each other, that's how you sort of try to solve this problem of the fact that SAF is significantly more expensive. So on this slide, I think the main thing I want to talk about is, first of all, just the fact that I have to update the slide all the time because new policies get passed. And also that we're here in Washington, which is a very unique environment where there's both a low carbon fuel market as well as a direct supply incentive, which is focused on SAF. But I also want to double click on Illinois specifically, because they have a very unique demand incentive, and their incentive is unique not only because it's demand, but because it has very loose blending restrictions. So what we're seeing right now is SAF that is being produced in Houston, Texas, is not only being sold in the Chicago market to claim the credit in Illinois, it's actually being blended in Texas and then put in the pipeline in Texas and then sent through the pipeline through all existing infrastructure up to Illinois and used there. So that is only enabled by the fact that the wording of the Illinois credit allows it, and not every state credit allows you to blend outside of the state. So that's just something to be aware of. So now, remembering that stacked bar chart I showed you where I talked about how we have incentives and then we also have SAF-C to make up the remaining of the gap. SAF-C is something that's difficult to explain in a brief talk like this, but essentially when we want to actually use SAF in planes, we are required by ASTM standards to blend it with conventional jet fuel. The maximum is usually 50%, but in practice, the market usually doesn't go above 30%. And once you do that blending, it becomes impractical or almost impossible to actually track which physical plane those physical SAF molecules got loaded onto. So what we do is we decouple the environmental attributes of that SAF and then track those separately and allocate them to airlines or corporate customers based on who made that transaction happen and who got the SAF into the system. And as you can imagine, when you separate the sort of digitized attributes of this fuel from the physical fuel, there are a lot of sort of raised eyebrows about the credibility of this scheme, especially when people try to claim emissions reductions from maybe something that wasn't actually in their physical plane. So as this slide states, the credibility of something like this is really important. So you have to have strong market infrastructure, which is why RMI runs our registry called the SAF-C registry. There's other registries on the market today, and they all follow similar but not all exactly the same rules. But they use, I know this in the rule book, or in the pamphlet that was distributed, it talks about book and claim. But essentially what this allows us to do is it allows us to reliably understand, okay, which airline was involved in this transaction and which corporate customer was involved in this transaction. So if you look up right now, as a plug, the SAF-C registry, which is a public website, you can look at our retirement table and you can see, okay, this volume was claimed by this airline, and then you can match that to a scope 3 version of that same volume and say, this corporate customer was the one who made that side of the deal with them. And now this is where I'm gonna get to what Michael was talking about. So this slide, this is a global slide, but sort of paints the same picture. These numbers are very large. Just as a rough estimate, just you can put it in your head that a global demand is about 100 billion gallons. So right now, announced capacity for what's going to be online in 2030 is about 10 billion gallons. And then current capacity for what's online now globally is about 2 billion gallons. So just keep that in mind for later. The first thing to note about this slide is that there's a lot of light green. So Michael was talking about HEFA. That's the pathway that we see leading the way. That's the pathway where when you're going to the bank to get investors, it's easiest to make that pitch because it's more mature. The feedstock supply chain is more built out. So that's what we see on the market. But we also see PTL coming online in Europe because of the sub-mandate that's there. The second key takeaway from this slide is that we see that plant announcements are pretty clearly concentrated where there's policy support. So we have the mandate strategy, which is being implemented in Europe as well as Asia Pacific. And then we have the incentive and voluntary market strategy, which is being implemented here in the US as well as Canada. And third and finally, as Michael said, announced capacity is not the same thing as production. The reality is that even though we're talking about 10 billion gallons announced or 2 billion gallons current capacity, global production for the year 2025 was actually closer to 700 million gallons. So less than half of what our capacity should be. And the reason for that is there's a long list of reasons why that would be. But it could be things like the plant is maybe just coming online and they're having some technology hurdles. Maybe they're not able to secure all the feedstock they need. Or maybe they can't secure all the financing they need because the market isn't comfortable enough, right? Like the investors don't feel comfortable because of the state of the market. So we did analysis at RMI at a facility level, and we found that 40% of announced capacity is at high risk of non-delivery. And then 3,500 million more gallons are planned, but could join that at-risk category. So again, just pointing out these things on the right that I don't have time to get into. You can have feedstock, technology, infrastructure, policy, and finance that all can place a roadblock in the way of getting your project from making a press release to actually producing volume, and then from actually producing volume to continuing to produce volume over a long period of time. And then I just want to give a quick shout out to some RMI resources that we have because we publish a lot of stuff on our website that I want to make sure people are aware of. We very recently published this Blueprints for Bankability playbook. I think it's a really great resource. It was a collaboration with World Energy as well as Microsoft, just sort of representing that corporate customer and SAF producer relationship, which RMI has a unique sort of vision into, talking about how.
We will share slides, so we could just.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, we have this bankability playbook. We have a contrails report, which was done in collaboration with ICCT, and we have our net zero airports, which was a output from some work we did last year. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Really good to see a lot of familiar faces. And I also am excited to talk about something slightly different. There will be some sustainable aviation fuel content. I can't help myself, but I'm excited to talk about some of the other ways that from an airport perspective, we get involved in reducing aviation climate impacts. So I wanted to talk a little bit more broadly about the sort of menu of sustainability innovation topics that we cover at our airport. We definitely, of course, as many of you have seen me in the role, we talk a lot about what airport specific role, and especially in the US airport world, what we can do in terms of enabling sustainable aviation fuel. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is that there are a lot of things that airports can do to help reduce emissions, especially as it relates to that operational efficiency bar, or I guess wedge in that emission chart that you saw. We are seeing more and more that we are able to use machine learning technology to really help drive efficiency and get emissions down a lot further for all the things that happen on the route into the airport as they're taxiing, as aircraft are taxiing and waiting for gates, what decisions airlines make, how we communicate those decisions to the airlines about what the consequences are. Now when we report wait and hold times to airlines, we also report what the CO2 emission consequences are of their decisions. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up is that we also, from an airport perspective, we look at the emissions associated with aviation in terms of the entire journey. You aren't coming to the airport just to come to the airport, although, you know, come hang out. We have lovely restaurants. But for the most part, your journey begins with the decision to get to the airport and then get on an aircraft. And so we think a lot about ways that we can reduce those emissions. We were the first airport in the world to require a carbon emission performance standard for ride-hailing apps like Uber and Lyft. And we also think a lot about, are there ways that we can tie your decision makers as customers to a whole sort of green travel experience, from what takes you to the airport to maybe some benefits you get at that airport to then getting SAF-C or SAF on that aircraft, so that we can sort of bring that entire green experience to you. So when it comes to our role as an airport, we'll probably get to this a little bit more in our discussion, but our airport here in Seattle, we're governed by the Port of Seattle, or owned and operated by the port. And so we have an economic development role with respect to that. So we've looked at what we could do in terms of helping to attract SAF production facilities. We've been involved in looking at a lot of different ways that we can participate in that. We've looked at what role we can play in infrastructure integration. We can talk all we want about all the SAF production, but how do you get it to the airport? It turns out in Seattle, that's a particularly challenging problem. It's not as difficult as in other cities, but that's an important part that we think or an airport role can be. And then this is again maybe one for a conversation later. We've also looked at what role we can play as an airport in reducing that incremental cost to SAF. The federal government restricts a lot of our ability to do much in that space, but we still like to explore that, and we actually partnered with RMI several years ago to look at innovative financing ways that airports could play a role in that. So we've done lots and lots of studies in relation to that. You can see RMI is on one of them, and WSU, a lot of my panelists here have participated in these studies that we've all done together to really look at the infrastructure here specifically, and even the entire supply chain that relates to this region in terms of feedstocks, finances, and infrastructure. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is other emission reduction technology exploration that we've done. You might hear a little bit more about how machine learning is being used to do better route planning so that we can do contrail avoidance. But we are also using machine learning to do better performance of the aircraft while they're at the gate and while they're at our airport. So one example that I've just put up here is that we use machine learning visual detection to look at whether aircraft are actually plugging into the ground systems when they're at our airports. If they don't plug into our ground systems, that is, we provide electrical and preconditioned air for those aircraft. If they don't, they have to run what is known as their auxiliary power unit, and that's basically a little generator in the back of an aircraft. And those generators, depending on the size of the aircraft, burn between 30 and 70 gallons of jet fuel per hour. So if you multiply that by the number of operations across all the airports in all of the world, it's a pretty significant number. A lot of airports have installed these types of technologies, but we don't always get the behavior change and the kind of use that we want. So one of the other things we're doing is doing microphone-based detection, because these APUs, they emit a distinct sound around 10,000 hertz, for those of you who care to know that number, that is distinct from main engine. And so we're actually able to detect whether that APU is on or off without needing to visually look at it and have additional sort of infrared camera systems or other things. And so if we can show the detection, change the behavior, basically on our screens that the pilots look at, say, you've exceeded your APU runtime limit, now there can be consequences. If we can bring those emissions down just at our airport, that's about 75,000 tons of CO2 per year. And that's over and above the existing behavior we have now. So we already have, I would say, 50-ish%, I guess, compliance. So we have a ways to go. And again, I just like to think about this from a total aviation system. If you just multiply that by the number of airports in this country, let alone the world, and getting that kind of compliance. So that's another thing that we like to look at. This is just to give you an example of that. For the nerds in the group, I know you like pictures. So the APU exhaust outlet is the thing at the back of the aircraft, in case you've ever wondered what that is. And that very bright purple line that's about 2/3 of the way up is the sound signal from an APU. So you can definitely, it's very distinct. The weird staccato signal there is actually the bell ringing when you move the jet bridge. And then this is just an experiment we've been doing here with the microphone detection. But the idea is what the pilots see here is that if these systems are on or off, they get warning systems about that they have exceeded their runtime. So with that, thank you. I will discuss more of that during the panel.
That is so interesting, Stephanie. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Hogrewe. I can't see that screen down there, so I'm going to use my slides. I'm a senior energy policy specialist with the Washington State Department of Commerce within our energy policy division. I was asked to give a high-level overview of the role Washington State government, and specifically the Department of Commerce, is playing in the development of the sustainable aviation sector. The Department of Commerce touches many areas of public service. I think I'm off. Okay, there we go. In Washington, as you can see here. And as I said, I work in the energy division within our energy policy office as part of the statewide Office of Renewable Fuels.
I move that.
A little bit, thank you. The Office of Renewable Fuels was established in 2022 by the legislature to accelerate a comprehensive market for green hydrogen and renewable fuels in Washington through research, community engagement, workforce development, and policy analysis. And then in 2023, the legislature directed the duties to specifically include alternative jet fuel as well. Back in 2021, Commerce published a state energy strategy, which is designed to provide a roadmap for meeting the state's greenhouse gas emissions limits and transition to 100% clean energy. And some key takeaways related to renewable fuels and sustainable aviation fuel include the recommendation to adopt a low carbon fuel standard to support transportation decarbonization. Clean fuel standard was passed in 2021. Thank you, ecology. That the replacement of liquid fuels is needed to meet emissions targets and would be a strategic and effective use of clean hydrogen, and that it could possibly be that we use excess renewable generation to produce hydrogen and renewable fuels, but we need a lot of new transmission and generation capacity to do so. In 2024, the Office of Renewable Fuels published the Green Electrolytic Hydrogen and Renewable Fuels Legislative Report with findings including the need to coordinate production with expanded renewable electricity capacity, that importing hydrogen and renewable fuels from other states may develop as a mechanism for cost effectiveness, and that siting and permitting reform for these sectors is needed, as well as the unique environmental justice concerns of these projects should be considered. This figure from the report shows that initially clean hydrogen is used directly in petroleum refining and bulk chemical production in the state, and over time most of the hydrogen consumption shifts to hydrogen-derived fuels to use in engines and turbines that currently run on diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, and fuel oil. This figure from the report shows where in the economy hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels are projected to be used. And I won't get into too much detail, but I'll highlight that the report projected the highest use in aviation, diesel, and marine fuels. In 2024, more recently, Commerce published our most recent biennial energy report, which identified some related next steps in Washington, including providing targeted state support to implement the recommendations from our legislative report, exploring and establishing tax incentives and other market development strategies to encourage the use of renewable fuels in strategic sectors, assessing feedstock supply and in-state production opportunities and their impacts, developing additional projects to use hydrogen and renewable fuels in aviation industry, heavy-duty transportation, and the maritime sector, and then prioritizing equity and environmental justice in the clean energy transition. I'd also like to share some of the enabling policies, this is the right slide, the enabling policies that exist here in Washington that make it a great place for the sustainable aviation fuel market and for the sustainable aviation sector broadly. Beyond the Clean Energy Transformation Act, CETA, and the Climate Commitment Act, some of these policies include alternative jet fuel tax credit for production, blending, and use, and a preferential business and occupation tax rate, a retail sales and use tax deferral for eligible investment projects, including clean fuels production facilities that meet certain labor standards, the Clean Fuel Program and Clean Fuel Standard, as I mentioned, which is administered by the Department of Ecology and now includes pathways for alternative jet fuel. Our colleagues at Ecology are also currently working on a sustainable aviation fuel programmatic environmental impact statement, which will lay the foundation for future project level environmental review and include studies on the impacts of producing and distributing SAF in state and potential ways to avoid, reduce, or mitigate those impacts. And then last year, the legislature created a new account called the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Account for activities supporting research development, environmental review, infrastructure to support the production of SAF, and funds for that account come from concession fees on duty-free sales and non-commercial aircraft taxes. And that can be spent through appropriation, though none has been done thus far. Some other potential funding opportunities at Commerce exist, and they include the Clean Energy Fund, the 2026 Clean Energy Research Development and Demonstration Program, and then the Office of Renewable Fuels Technical Assistance Program for strategic end uses of hydrogen, which I will cover shortly. We also have a large variety of tax credits and incentives available to support companies with sector-specific resources, some tax incentives related to manufacturing, research and development, and new jobs in rural counties, and a whole Office of Economic Development and Competitiveness to help with site selection if companies are coming into the state. I'll leave this up here shortly, but the current budget provides funding for a number of SAF-related items, many of which I've touched on already, so these are here for reference. I don't think I've mentioned WashDOT's Sustainable Aviation Grant Program, but most everything else up here I will or have touched on, or others will touch on. I also wanted to highlight a couple of the related projects that the Office of Renewable Fuels has published in the last year, including this environmental justice toolkit for hydrogen project developers, which has a lot of useful guidance and information on best practices for community engagement and tribal engagement that are transferable to other projects, including the SAF sector. Another major report was the PNW low carbon hydrogen analysis in collaboration with British Columbia and Penware. And then, as mentioned, our office is currently developing a technical assistance program to support projects that prioritize strategic end uses of hydrogen, including hydrogen-derived fuels, so SAF as well, for benefit of public agencies, tribal nations, and industrial partners. And we recently closed our request for information and are in the program design phase, though we intend to launch the next phase in the next couple of months. And then lastly, I wanted to highlight the partnerships and collaborative efforts related to SAF. Oh, thank you. Great. Related to SAF and other renewable fuels in our region that Commerce is working to support both through funding and participation. And we're extremely grateful to these groups. They include academia, local governments, ports, industry, environmental groups, everybody that you see here today. It takes a lot of work and investment across the region and across many sectors to address the challenges facing the SAF transition. So we appreciate getting to be a part of it. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Sure. Okay. Thank you all very much for sharing. We're going to move into some Q&A. So I have a few prepared questions, and then we will have time for some audience questions as well. So go ahead and think of those. That was a broad array of different challenges, solutions, strategies. I want to probe a little deeper on the contrails avoidance or contrails mitigation strategies, because I think Nick and Michael and others also made a really compelling argument for why that is a place we should focus. And so not everyone has to answer each question, by the way, but I'll pose a question about contrails. What would it actually take to make contrail avoidance a standard part of flight planning? So Michael, you spoke to this a little bit. I don't know if you want to start us off here, and then I would love to hear from others as well.
Sure. From the operational standpoint, there's a number of aspects that would have to integrate sort of weather predictions and observations with air traffic control on there. And some of those would involve sort of pilot decision types of aspects rather than having to go back to the tower to modify sort of flight paths and things along this line. The other part that we're kind of looking at is when you do these avoidance, do you put forth, more CO2 in there, and it's going to counteract some of that aspect, and trying to understand that more fundamentally. But in terms of the pure avoidance part of things with that, you have to integrate those components. And then the last thing I want to put forth in this is that SAF does have a role with this, because it puts out particles, and those particles nucleate the water vapor to form ice crystals, which is the contrail that you see within there. And so better understanding what components of SAF do that, and how we can design these, and how much impact would it have? Would the supersaturated environment still nucleate them from disturbing dust and whatnot that's in the atmosphere already? Or does the contribution coming out the engines have a significant part? These are still unknowns that are there, but that would be another component.
Thanks for mentioning the SAF. I was going to ask that as a follow-up, so that's great that you already talked about that. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
Just to add on to what Michael was saying, such great content so far on this. We all have a role to play on contrails, and I think from our perspective at Boeing, it's trying to help the community reduce the air range with bringing more evidence-based solutions. So there's just two things I wanted to highlight on that. The first is related to 100% SAF and different types of fuel blends. So two falls ago, we partnered with NASA and United Airlines. We took a MAX 10 up around this area. We just flew it out into the Sound on a number of flight profile missions with different blends of fuel. We used traditional Jet A, we used a 50-50 blend, and we went 100% as well. And the cool part about these tests is we had the Dash 10 flying around, which is still under certification right now, right? So that was already kind of cool. But we had a NASA chase plane behind it, like a DC-8 flying test bed lab with a bunch of sniffers on it. And they just, like, if you were out in the sound that day, like looking around, you've been like, what is this? Is super weird. They're playing follow the leader. But we got a ton of great in-flight data, right, about what's happening with the ice crystal formation at altitude in the real world. So like that kind of data is super important. It takes a lot to process that data, actually. So we're like still crunching on it. We've released some of it. We're going to release more of it this year. We're going to make that available to the community. That's not something we're trying to hold on and monetize. It's data that's going to be useful for everybody. And then the second one is we're also partnering with Honeywell to create humidity sensors that we can put on our aircraft. We have thousands of flights every day that could collect data. We just need to arm the aircraft and get that data loop going. So that's in work as well.
I'll jump in on this one too. So I think contrail avoidance is something that's still at too early of a stage to mandate putting in practice. I think now is really the time to focus on improving data collection, as Ryan alluded to. But I think we're actually in a really promising place with that. The EU, for example, has implemented a monitoring, reporting, and verification scheme where airlines are now collecting data for potential contrail forming behavior in the EU. I think the core thing to think about, though, is I think we've done a good job of figuring out, okay, what's the historic contrail formation? Can we look backwards and identify where persistent contrails were formed because of aviation? But the next step is looking at what behavior contributes to future contrail formation and how can we avoid that and properly credit it? And from there, how can we incorporate that into a work stream so that it can be a day-to-day part of airline behavior? There's two airlines in particular that have begun doing a few trials like this. American Airlines has done, I think, at least 100 flights, and TUI Airlines based out of the UK. And they've actually had some success identifying best practices, getting the information from the weather prediction models to the dispatchers, to the pilots. Now there's software which can help identify rerouting opportunities and calculate the fuel burn penalty. And so far, the results have been really promising. I think when you put it in terms of CO2e, it's about under $20 per ton equivalent for CO2e avoided. And the fuel burn penalty is quite low, about 2% in their tests.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks all. Stephanie, is there anything you want to add about ways that the airport is addressing non-CO2 emissions, or do you feel like you covered that enough?
I guess I'll just add onto really the EU side of things. I also participate on EU-based airport programs, and we've been hearing that one of the things that they're looking at is really addressing this sort of system-wide and saying, are there specific airports and do they have the kind of segregated fueling systems? And there's a lot of if-then statements to this, but they're at least examining this system-wide to say, are there some airports that have a high percentage of these North Atlantic contrail-forming flights where you could target the higher percentage of SAF? And then looking at it still meeting the mandates, but actually from a policy standpoint, targeting that. So that's something that's being looked at, and I agree that we need much more sound science before we decide we want to, have all these segregated tanks. But it's an interesting aspect of looking at, from an airport fueling perspective, where do you want to maybe target that high percent of SAF?
For a visual on contrail formation, I will point you to page 18 of the pamphlet in front of you, the 101 doc, because we've been talking about it as if we're all on the same page. We might not all be on the same page. So 18. I want to ask a question about more of like the regional lens. So we heard a little bit from Lauren about some of the enabling policies. What other advantages do we have in the Northwest specifically in terms of addressing aviation's climate impacts? This is for anyone, or Lauren, if you want to. Yeah, for anyone. Lauren, did you want to start? Okay.
You can get, I have something.
I'm a professor, so I'm a professional talker. I've always viewed this as SAF and sustainable aviation is a natural thing for the state of Washington in particular, but for the Northwest because it was the birthplace of commercial aviation. And it is one of the strongest environmental tenets of any place in the country or world for that matter on there. So really these come together, and a lot of this is demanded by the customer base because these are not attitudes of the government, but are attitudes of the people of this region and an expectation going forward on that. So I think that this region has a very strong piece to it. What's really encouraging is, despite the fact that we were amongst the first in forming sort of roadmaps and whatnot for sustainable aviation fuels and whatnot with this, what's really encouraging was Jason's map of showing all of now the states that are coming forward into this sort of side of things and influencing policy and other aspects. And this is critical because our federal government, as we all see, goes up and down as parties change within there. But the states seem to stay a lot more constant with that aspect. And especially when you see allied states from California to Oregon to Washington and into the province of British Columbia have similar policies to that. If you add up the economic engines of those, it ranks very highly in the world in terms of nations for that. So the state can play a really important role for that, and as we see things, change in the federal government, it seems like we go 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but we continue to go forward when we're still a lot further along than we were, when we first started this. I first started this back in 2010 or something along that line. So anyways, I think that regions are really important, especially here in the States.
Yeah, agree with everything Michael said. I think one thing that's worth mentioning is just the simple geographical advantage of having a port with easy connection into Asia Pacific. We're seeing not only SAF itself, but also the feedstocks for SAF become more and more commoditized, more and more traded. And something that maybe would surprise some folks is that the overall cost and the CI penalty for transporting those feedstocks around the world is actually pretty low. So that's something that we're seeing happening all the time, feedstocks making their way around the world on sea. So it will be an advantage for Seattle to have connections into Asia Pacific where there's a lot of feedstocks coming from. And also there's other things like, obviously the ambition of the state itself, as well as, the ambitions of corporations who call Seattle home and things like that will play a major role into their motivation for they want to have SAF at their home airport, or they want to have, they want to see their state that they call home moving forward. So there's some things I wanted to shout out.
Anything?
I'll add, we also have WSU, and they're an amazing partner in all things SAF related. So,
all right, I want to make sure we have time for some audience Q&A. I don't know if we have roaming mics, but I think the room is small enough that we'll hear you if you enunciate and speak up. So, does anyone have a question for one or more of our panelists? Yeah, Kyle.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. We heard first from Boeing and then from this good professor about demand signal and that driving Boeing's behavior. Either of the carrot sort that we're seeing in the States or perhaps punitive in the form of carbon price.
Yeah, I'll start in on that, and I'm sure the second panel is going to dive straight into that as well, but I'll give one perspective. So one thing not everyone appreciated, I realized this at the Cascadia event, which was awesome, by the way, and Earth Finance should get a lot of credit for catalyzing Cascadia. And to that last question, for those of you that were there during that launch, that was like the most energy I've seen around SAF anywhere in the world, really. And so Washington should be proud of that. Boeing has been procuring SAF for a number of years to support our flight test operations here in Washington State. We also do it in Charleston, South Carolina, to support 787 deliveries. This year, we're going to be blending in 30% SAF as a percentage of our total demand, right? The reason we're doing that, we're not an airline, right? Ultimately, the airlines need to be at the front of the line of accessing SAF at good pricing. We're doing it so we can illustrate a demand signal and kind of like find out how to do this. Like from an offtake structure standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint, we have so many discoveries already on like what kind of contracting actually works for this. Our internal controls on like buying this stuff, like nobody's solved that before. I'm like, hey, CFO, we need a 10-year fixed agreement on fuel. He's like, what? We've never done that, you know? So that kind of stuff, the details of just, I mean, we can talk about the wedges and all that, but like the details of like just getting it done is really important. And so like that, we're trying to do that. And then we're trying to share lessons with, you know, our airline friends and to try to like figure this out together because it is so novel. Is it enough? I know, like we need continued supportive policy that is long-term and stable, and we can talk about revenue certainty mechanisms, you know, like there's a lot more that I think we can do. We have a good foundation, but I don't think it's enough.
I'll talk a little bit more from the technology improvement side of things with this. So the question is this sustainable? That is the one piece that is completely sustainable. And the reason why is because all of that works on fuel efficiency of the plane. And for airlines, Courtney, Alaska Airlines, I haven't seen you in here. I know you're here somewhere. There you are. But for the airlines, it's like 60% of the operating expenses for there. So if you can save fuel on that, it lifts all boats. It lowers emissions and it lowers operating costs, ticket prices, right? Things along that line. So what happens is that I think the continual efforts to make more fuel efficient aircraft is a totally sustainable aspect that's almost independent of the climate, component to that, but is a great benefit of the, but climate benefits from that aspect tremendously. So.
Any other audience questions? We do have mics now. And actually, would you mind introducing yourself before that was
Josh Hine, Washington State University. I have a question for Stephanie. We were talking about the APU emissions. I'm curious, and I know the airport's done some work on ground quality emissions. Has there been any work in the relative impact of APU emissions versus main engine emissions at the airport, and what kind of impact you have beyond just the CO2 benefit of not running APUs?
So you're talking air quality.
Air quality, yeah.
We haven't. When we do any kind of, we have to do modeling exercises for every time we do any kind of large airport growth or project proposal. So as part of that, we model those separately. So we do have a sense of those impacts. How well those models actually handle high temperature plumes when they're dispersing is another question. But there have been some studies at European airports that have looked more specifically at the impact of those APU emissions, especially on ramp workers or apron. I'm trying to think of like I speak airport. So on where you see the aircraft parked, ramp apron, there have been studies of that and have compared those to other emissions. But we haven't done that specifically at our airport. I'm happy to if you would like data of the segregation of those, I'm happy to provide them. But they have done studies in terms of the workers on that are around those aircraft and what those impacts are. Because main engine, it's really as they're taxiing and then those are shut down, but APU emissions can last the entire time that aircraft is there. So it's a dramatically different impact compared to main engine.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more quick one, quick-ish. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Pete Mills, former congressional staff and former Port of Seattle employee. Shout out to Commissioner Calkins, who's just arrived in the back room, or arrived a little bit ago, but welcome. My question is related to the big rocks. Like, it seems like we've been at this sometime. And back when I was congressional staff, I toured WSU and the work that's being, and it's absolutely amazing. We've had other SAF programs a decade or more ago. I'm impatient. Look, where are the big rocks? What do people, particularly on the political side and others, where can we focus to get the biggest bang for the buck?
I'm actually going to jump in here because my last question was, what is one key action-oriented takeaway? So I'm going to piggyback on that and have everyone take a sec and think of your takeaway that you want to leave with the audience. You can take it in that direction. What are the big rocks? What do we need to focus on right now from your perspective? And I think, Ryan, if you're okay to start again, we would start on your end and come all the way down.
Look, and I'll end where I started, right? Which is we need a really good environment to build and certify airplanes. Right, that's our contribution to this, is fuel efficient aircraft, building them consistently. And so if that environment exists at the federal level and at the state level, we're going to be able to do that. So that's one of my answers. The other answer around non-airplane stuff on SAF, I think Mike's chart showed it, which is there's a gap between like what's potential and what's happening, right? And it's most of it, I think, is trying to close the premium that makes sense for the demand side to participate. And so I think we need to really attack that stack and find the 25 cents here and the 50 cents here and just reduce the premium of SAF. That's probably going to unlock everything.
I'll give two. I'll give one for industry, one for policymakers.
Hey, yeah, we gotta have some.
Then I'll focus on policymaking, but we can talk about the industry one later. So I would say policymaking, to build on that, I would say for solutions like SAF, it's a very risky enterprise. The fuel is expensive. It's going to be much more expensive than fossil fuel for the foreseeable future. There's no incentive to make it and consume it out of the goodness of your heart. It's only going to be consumed if you're forced to, or if it's subsidized down to the price of fossil fuel. So then it's up to policymakers to establish a political economy that can support one of those two routes to SAF adoption with the least pushback, either a mix of tax credits or subsidies, or a stable policy signal like a SAF mandate or a carbon price, or some combination thereof. If you don't have that, if you're just relying on tax credits that kind of flicker into existence one year, disappear the next, the SAF won't arrive.
Well, my top two rocks are already taken, so economics and policy. I don't know how to say it any different with regard to those aspects of things. But I guess I'll spin those into another component, and that is bankability. And now that we got the book written on it, we're all set, right? Yep. Jason? But online. Yeah, but financeability of this is a critical aspect to going forward in these areas. And that's because we're not going to, we're a capitalist society, so we need to build this into this system. And so that means that we need to develop all of these other rocks to be able to finance plants to go forward and do this. And so I think a focus on, policy and economics are super important, but they got to join together to get the financing.
Yeah, I'll follow that up, and I'll sort of say, like, I'll leave it to the audience to decide if this is another rock or if it's kind of just a part of his rock. Yeah, I mean, I would just say, sort of going back to what Michael and I were talking about before, like, I think the battle is not finished when the policy gets passed, and it's also not finished when the press release gets posted, because we've seen plants get built and then fail after a year or after 2 years. We've seen policies get passed and no one comes and claims them. So I would just say that, you know, it is really challenging to spur this industry forward, but there is momentum and there are a lot of people who want to make it happen. But also we can't reach a milestone and then take our foot off the gas on that specific issue. So I think just continuing to push and not sort of letting off. I guess that'll be mine.
Yeah, it's hard when you get to this side end of the table. It's like ditto, ditto, ditto. I guess I'll add the airport spin on this, and especially because I think just glancing, I can see 4 producers. Just I apologize if I hadn't counted them all, 5 actually in the room, and I know all of you are working hard on SAF production, and a lot of you want to get it into this airport. So my major takeaway is that we really need to find a way to build open access, receiving, blending, and storage facilities for SAF to make sure that if you want to also bring that cost down, that it gets as smoothly into the delivery system of airports as possible without creating many touch points and handling points where you have to transfer from truck to train and so forth. So that's my big takeaway.
And building off of that, maybe zooming out even broader, addressing the renewable energy and transmission challenges that we have in the state to ensure that, and the infrastructure piece that Stephanie mentioned, to ensure that SAF usage happens in state and that the benefits of SAF and sustainable aviation are felt by communities in Washington, so we could lower air quality or improve air quality and lower pollution for airport side communities.
Thank you all so much.
Can I leave with one more thought on this?
Another rock?
I told you I'm a professor. It's not a rock. So I just want to remind the audience of this, is that energy transitions are super hard. They're really, really difficult. Moby Dick was written in the 1850s at the height of whaling, and peak of whaling, and it was for an energy system for that, and kerosene was coming into play to substitute for this, and we're still harvesting whales today, mostly for industrial products. So these transitions are really difficult and take a long time for that. So I'll just leave the audience with that thought.
Okay, a big round of applause for our first panel. Thank you all so much. We are going to transition to our second panel, which will be moderated by founding CETI board member Ross McFarlane. Ross is a longtime climate and clean energy advocate, and he led the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Northwest, the first regional stakeholder roadmap for cleaner fuels to power the next generation of flight.
So thanks, everyone. Again, I'm Ross McFarlane, and I'm excited to be here. I think the last panel ended up in a perfect place for where we're going to be starting here. You know, we ended up place I always like to remind folks, you know, a lot of folks, especially in the community I live in the environmental NGO world, are always going, you know, is this just greenwashing? Is it people talking about sustainable aviation fuels in there? Is this just a hoax? And are they just making this up? And I try to remind them, you know, this is the toughest corner in the toughest block of the toughest neighborhood of the entire area of decarbonization. And, you know, it's going to be hard. And it has been hard. We have a great panel here today to talk about the specific area that the Northwest has been working on the longest around the aviation decarbonization issue, which is sustainable aviation fuels. And I'm just really excited with the folks that we've been able to put here today. Unlike how we did it last time, I'm going to introduce them one by one and allow them to do brief introductions again in slides. And then we'll have chance for some moderator questions and again, some audience Q&A. But Before I do that, I'll also say that we had one additional panelist who was introduced to you previously, Max Saby from the Breakthrough Energy, who was really excited to be here, but decided he didn't want to share his flu with us all. So, it's probably a good idea, and also not sharing it on whatever plane he was going to be on. So Max was disappointed to be here, but Breakthrough Energy is doing some really exciting work around SAF, and it would have been fun to hear. So I encourage everyone to go onto their website and learn more about that. So first I'm going to introduce Andy Billig, who's with SkyNRG. Previously to SkyNRG, Andy Billig was with a Washington State Senator and was for many years the president of the Washington State Senate. I'll say that the fact that Washington State is and has been a leader in sustainable aviation fuels for many years is probably dependent as much as anything on Andy's leadership as anything else. Because, back in 2011, a whole group of folks, and many people in this room are very familiar with this, a group of companies and nonprofit organizations, other folks released what was the first stakeholder report in the world called Sustainable Aviation Fuels Northwest. That was an effort to try to lay out a roadmap for how you could create regional supply chains for sustainable aviation fuels and outlining the importance of it. Now, I'll say, since I was involved in it, I'll say it was a great report. But there have been a lot of great reports. And oftentimes, I've been involved in a lot of great reports. And oftentimes, you do them and they fall and nothing happens. But we had a leader in the Washington State Senate who said, I think we should actually create a working group, and we should get some funding for that working group. And then we should keep that going every year. And then we should make sure that there's reports back to the legislature. And then we should start having specific recommendations. And then we should make sure the legislature acts on those recommendations. And the fact that that has happened and that there has been the series of actions on that is due to Andy's leadership as much as anything else. With that introduction, I'm going to ask Andy to talk about the specific project that he's working with SkyNRG, who SkyNRG is, what they're working on now, and how they're ensuring that that's a sustainable project. Andy.
Thanks, Ross. I appreciate the very kind and maybe slightly exaggerated introduction, but thank you. Really glad to be with you. So great to see so many friends in the room, and very excited to share with you a little bit about SkyNRG and Project Widgeon, which is our Washington State project, and all of the momentum that we have for this project right now. I'm going to use my notes because it's hard to see the screen, but that screen is unbelievable. So I'm sneaking back in here for the Super Bowl. If anybody wants to join me, welcome.
You can see the screen down there.
Yeah, well, that one's a little, I'm good either way. So let's see. Okay. All right. So first, a little bit about SkyNRG. We're a Dutch company founded about 15 years ago and based in Amsterdam. And SkyNRG, 15 years old for a sustainable aviation fuel company is really old, because the industry is really not much older than that. And SkyNRG has really focused mostly on connecting buyers and sellers and sort of facilitating the industry, and also doing consulting and regional assessments. But what the founders of our company really realized a few years ago was what the industry really needs is production. And so we still do all those other things, but now we're really focused on production. So we have 3 plants, sustainable aviation fuel plants, that are currently under development. The first one is in the Netherlands, and that's going to be a HEFA project. The second one that I'll mention is Project Skycraft, which is in Sweden, and it is a e-fuels project. And then Project Widgeon, which is here in Washington State, which I'll talk a lot more about. So SkyNRG has SkyNRG BV, which is the Dutch company, and then we have a subsidiary, SkyNRG Americas, and that's who is developing the Washington State project. And SkyNRG's largest investor is Macquarie, an Australian company. It's the largest infrastructure asset manager in the world, and really with a green focus. So diving right into Project Widgeon, it's a 50 million gallon a year SAF facility located in Eastern Washington. We have lots of offtake interest that we're talking to domestic and international airlines, and it's going to be RNG based, renewable natural gas, which I'll talk more about in a second. We're in a really key point in the timeline where we have completed our pre-feed, which is the sort of early engineering. And then we just announced passing a very significant milestone by getting through the SEPA permitting process, which was more than a year of work and a really significant step to the project moving forward. And our next step will be to move into FEED, which is the more detailed engineering and design. Our site is in Wallula, Washington, which is in Walla Walla County, but actually closer to the Tri-Cities, about 16 miles from Pasco. We're using RNG, renewable natural gas, as our feedstock, coming mostly from landfills, so landfill gas, and then a little bit from dairy digesters. Our technology is existing TRL9 Fischer-Tropsch technology, so it's all technology that's been used and proven. We have a lot of potential to scale up, not just scale up using RNG, but this same plant could be turned into an e-fuels plant in the future. And then we have a strong economic case to use SAF here in Washington State, but it also would be effective and could be economically significant in the UK or in the EU with the mandates there. And you can see the timeline on the bottom. This next slide, I'm just going to touch on for a moment. I just wanted to show you on the map where we are. And you can see in southeast Washington. And I think most of the other things I'm going to touch on for the sake of time. I'll move on to the next one. This is a diagram of our plant, and one of the things that's really significant about this location is that we are on a rail line, which is really important, and we're also on a natural gas pipeline, which is really important. So I think later on we're going to talk about book and claim for feedstocks, but we are going to use mass balance accounting for our renewable natural gas. So it was really important to be right on a pipeline. You'll see also in this diagram on the right side is a dairy digester, which won't be in the first phase of the project, but we may be able to create the RNG right on site. So one of the questions I was asked to address was why Washington State? And this is my favorite topic because I love Washington State, and I love how Washington is such a leader in aerospace and in SAF. So the first is that, and you've already heard this, I mean, and you know this, that Washington is an aerospace hub. And when you think about Boeing and WSU, and by the way, Boeing has been just an incredible partner of SkyNRG, and really we wouldn't be this far along with Project Widgeon if it weren't for the support and partnership with Boeing. But we've got Boeing, we've got WSU, we've got airlines that are interested. We have airports that are interested, particularly the Port of Seattle and Spokane. We kind of have everything. We have diverse feedstocks here, but because it's such an aerospace hub, it was just a welcoming place to create a SAF facility here. And it's because of that hub that we have such good policies here. So that comes to the next, which is the Washington State tax incentive for SAF. And for this tax incentive, different than some of the other tax incentives in other states, you have to produce and use the SAF in Washington State. And it's the most generous SAF incentive out of any state in the country. We also have the Washington Clean Fuel Standard, which is crucial. And it particularly allows RNG to SAF within the Clean Fuel Standard. And then just the general support from the governor, the agencies, Department of Ecology, Department of Commerce, and the legislature has been incredibly welcoming and supportive. And some of those things you heard Lauren talk about from the Department of Commerce with site selection and technical assistance, we've utilized all of that. And it's really a key reason why we're here. And then lastly, what's next? So as I mentioned, we're about to enter the FEED stage, which is really a key step. That will take us all the way up to FID, which is the final investment decision, which is when construction starts. The next steps for us, we have to sign an EPC contractor, which we're very close to. That's the actual firm that will do this advanced engineering and design. We have to sign a couple of additional offtakes, which we're in advanced discussions on. Then we'll initiate discussion or construction in 2028, and then produce SAF in 2030, 2031. And that's it.
Thank you. So
Ross, can I just say one other thing I always like to mention? People always ask, what's Widgeon? What's Project Widgeon? So all of our US plants, but we only have one that we've announced that's far enough along in development, but they're all named after a bird that is also a plane. So you can look up what a widgeon is.
there you go. There you go. Well, so I mentioned we've been working on SAF for a long time, and the exciting thing is we're finally getting plants that are under construction in Washington State, or in that stage of being permitted and being built. And so our next speaker is working on another one of those in Moses Lake. Derek Phelps is head of policy and government affairs for 12, which is working on one in Moses Lake with using a different kind of technology, power to liquids. So Derek, tell us about your facility.
Thank you, Ross. Yeah, I'm excited to be here, and postgraduate students at Stanford University working at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, Kendra Cull, Dr. Itasha Cave, and Nicholas Flanders. The first two really discovered and launched the science, and the third person, Nicholas Flanders, is our CEO. And really, we position the company as the first slide maybe says, there we go, that really our offering, our purpose, our mission is to deliver a world made from air. And what that really means in practice is that it's our view that there's enough carbon dioxide above the ground that we don't need to keep taking more carbon dioxide out of the ground. And so we position that in practice where our technology allows us to transform and really convert the CO2 molecule into other products. And so what we're doing right now is we're building air plants. And our first air plant is here in Washington State at Moses Lake, where it's really demonstration scale. And that positions us to deliver products, chemicals, materials, and fuels under our trade name CO2 Made. And really our fuels is marketed under the trade name E-Jet. And at our plant in Moses Lake, we're going to be producing output that is about 80% E-Jet with 20% E-Naphtha, which will service our other customers in other areas. We've done demonstration projects with Mercedes-Benz and Procter & Gamble Tide Laundry for Tide Laundry detergent. You'll hear later this year, I think, about some really amazing and exciting announcements associated with our CO2 Made E-Naphtha product offering. But, our technology really delivers what we consider a very exciting transformational E-Jet sustainable aviation fuel product that delivers a 90% reduction in carbon footprint. This slide illustrates for you the CO2 profile of traditional fossil fuel-based Jet A, and you can see right alongside that our E-Jet is about 90% reduction in carbon footprint. Now, what does our air plant look like? Our air plant, and this is indicative of our Moses Lake plant, really takes three inputs: CO2, we convert that molecule; water, H2O, we convert that molecule; and then electricity. And so what we do is we take that hydrogen out of the H2O and use that as the energy carrier. And the carbon dioxide is converted over to CO for carbon monoxide, and that becomes our mass. And then we run both of those, all three of those, through two trains of electrolysis processes. One is our proprietary CO2 electrolysis process, and the other is water electrolyzers. If you're familiar with fuel cells, you know, fuel cells will take hydrogen and make electricity. If you reverse that, you keep that architecture, but if you reverse that process and you put electricity through a water electrolyzer and out comes hydrogen, that's a water electrolyzer, right? So we're using Plug as our partner for our water electrolyzers. We're using our own CO2 electrolysis process, which is our proprietary technology, and we make a syngas. That syngas then has to be liquefied, so we put that through a Fischer-Tropsch process, and ultimately out comes our products. And this photograph was taken right around the Christmas holidays, during the Christmas break. And if you look in the very back of it, you'll see that little square building there. We have 4 of our CO2 electrolyzers in that. Kind of over to the right here is our Fischer-Tropsch process, which liquefies the fuel. We've got our hydrocracker right in front of you, and then our gas flue tower coming out of the top. And I'm convinced that you can make anything look sexy if you put it in front of a sunset. So our delivery process for our offtake of E-Jet fuel involves starting with the air plant. We've got partners in line already, including Dimensional Energy at our air plant in Moses Lake, and transporting and blending with a number of different partners, including World Energy. And then we've got some spectacular, wonderful, absolutely amazing partners like Alaska Airlines and Microsoft. And then, you know, as I mentioned, we've got about a 90% reduction in carbon footprint associated with our E-Jet. Happy to say that we've got about $3 billion in contracted offtake right now through partners like International Airlines Group and British Airways, Aer Lingus, Alaska Airlines, and Saba, and Microsoft. A lot of these companies and others that I'm not even mentioning yet are early partners in investing in our technology and our business pathway, and are also positioned to be off-takers once we go into our commercial phase. We have completed our plant at Moses Lake. We are now starting to light it up very, very, very slowly. We're taking about a week or two to light up each piece of the plant, kind of make sure that, you know, each piece integrates nicely with the next piece. It'll take us about a month to 6 weeks because, boy, we don't want to break anything. The supply line for getting replacement parts could be awful. It would inject a year or more of delay. So we're trying very hard to make sure that nothing goes sideways as we start it up. But once we do, which will be in the next few weeks, we will be making fuel until we get to about 1,000 gallons. And then once we're at 1,000 gallons, we're going to be doing our first flight with Alaska Airlines. And that'll involve a flight that'll run from SeaTac down to San Francisco, we anticipate. Nice, exciting ribbon cutting in Moses Lake associated with a first flight that'll probably be in the early part of the second quarter, kind of thinking May. And then right after that, I anticipate we'll be announcing the location of our first commercial scale plant. That'll be about $1 billion to build that, and we'll be breaking ground by the end of this year. Won't surprise you to learn that that's probably going to be in the Midwest. We're looking at states, including North Dakota, all the way down to northern Texas. We're very close to making a decision on that. You know, you look at plants up north, you can get CO2 at a good price. You know, you look at plants down south, you can get hydrogen at a good price, but you also have to factor in the value and the cost of the electricity with all of this. Because did I mention our technology is, you know, PTL, power to liquids. So the cost of electricity, the cost of the electrons is a very big deal for us. But We're excited because this is the year that we bring E-Jet to the world, and we're going to be doing it from Moses Lake in Washington State. And I want to call out, you know, incredible policy leaders like Andy Billig. You know, we've got wonderful partners that we've been working with all the way from, you know, Governor Inslee, who was at our groundbreaking in the summer of 23. And, you know, we're hopeful that we'll have Governor Ferguson there when we do our ribbon cutting this spring. You know, amazing legislators that we've been talking to. The Department of Ecology has been open and accessible, and you know, we feel every day that they share our commitment to bring, you know, sustainable aviation fuel to the world, and to keep Washington State as the center of the universe for that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Derek. So turning from the producers to airlines, who are the ones who are going to be using most of this fuel. So we're excited to have Courtney Unruh, who is Vice President for Sustainable Aviation Fuel at Qantas. Prior to that, she also ran the SAF program at Alaska for a number of years. So Courtney, what's going on at Qantas, and why are you so excited about this stuff?
Thanks for the intro. I thought maybe first I should start with who Qantas is, because a lot of you probably have either not had the privilege of flying Qantas, or maybe have never even heard of us. So first off, that is not misspelled. That is how you spell it. There is no U. I know that's very hard for us Americans to understand. But Qantas has been around for over 100 years, and we're based in Sydney, Australia. So it's an Australian airline. We do fly all around the world. So we have a lot of US flights up and down the West Coast. We fly to Canada, Europe, South Africa, all around the world. And our mission really is to connect Australia to the world. If you haven't flown to Australia, it is a really, really long flight. A wonderful flight on Qantas, might I add, but a very long flight. Australia is quite isolated. It is an island, and it takes 15 hours from LA to get there. And so folks in Australia need aviation more than many other countries you would think need aviation. And so the aviation industry down there is incredibly vital, and it is a huge part of why we continue to operate so strongly down there. To be able to be around for the next 100 years, we have very strong and ambitious climate goals. And so the first two are near-term climate goals to reach 10% SAF in our operation by 2030 and to curb our emissions by 25%. That goal is very ambitious and really exciting. The third one, this one is a typo. It is our mission to reach net zero by 2050, but that's absolutely supposed to say emissions. So that one, yeah, you can call me out on. But that's our longer term goal. So to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And much of that will encompass SAF within our operations. You'll see some other pillars beyond just SAF below. So much of the stuff that Ryan talked about is incorporated in our larger plan to reach net zero. But SAF will be a huge component of how we get there. And then you'll see some other pieces at the bottom as well. So we have a strong investment strategy I'll talk a little bit more about. We're partnering closely with corporate customers to help make SAF a reality, and government and policy is absolutely key to pulling all of this off. I only have 2 slides. This is my second one. I know policy was talked about a ton beforehand, but I think that this map highlights nicely how important policy is to actually making SAF a reality. And much of the regions that are circled in red have supportive SAF policy, and much of the regions where there is no SAF production, or you'll see Australia down there that only has 2% of anticipated SAF production by 2030, there is no policy in place. And so this is a key goal for us moving forward to get to 2050, is to create a domestic SAF industry in Australia and to have a supportive SAF policy in place in Australia. So if you're a producer in this room and you haven't looked at Australia as a place to set up shop, please do come talk to me. I'm hopeful to have more announcements on policy in the next year or so. We're working really closely with the government there to make it happen. And we will not reach our goals without a domestic SAF industry in Australia. So this is absolutely vital for Qantas. About 70% of our flights originate in Australia. We have to have SAF there to reach that goal. The other interesting part, and a reason I was actually asked to be on this panel, is why would we even be interested in SAF in the US? And I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that without a domestic SAF industry in Australia, we have to look elsewhere to where we'll get our supply, at least in the next decade or so. SAF plants are not built overnight. We've talked a lot about that. And so while we're setting up shop there, we're looking to the US, to Canada, to Europe to purchase SAF and to partner with corporate customers in making that happen. And so in the US, we are already purchasing SAF. We purchase SAF out of LA. We'll announce a second location pretty quickly in this region of the world as well. And we'll continue to sign more offtakes in locations where SAF is being procured today. And that is our main opportunity to get SAF in the near term and hit our 2030 goal. So you'll see Qantas, even though we maybe don't do a ton of business in Seattle, you'll see us continuing to purchase SAF in areas where we don't always travel to.
Thank you. So next we have the corporate side. Lauren Kickham is Director of Markets and Investment and Energy Connectivity and Sustainability Team for Microsoft. So Lauren, interested in you talking about why Microsoft is investing in this area, how you're interested in looking at SAF as a way of meeting your Scope 3 commitments, and what kind of SAF you're interested in investing in.
Thank you so much, Ross, and to CETI and to all of you for your continued attention. Lauren Kickham. I'm, as Ross mentioned, on Microsoft's Central Sustainability Team. And at Microsoft, our sustainability work really starts with us addressing our own climate impact and footprint. And at the same time, working with our partners, our customers, markets to move the solutions forward at scale so we can all meet our commitments and global decarbonization. In 2020, we announced bold sustainability commitments to be carbon negative, water positive, zero waste, and protect ecosystems by 2030. We're now, mid-decade, a little bit past that, and are steadfast in that commitment and those commitments to reach those goals by 2030, and we're staying very focused on where we need to have impact to really move the needle for ourselves and for others. How are we doing? We are making great progress in certain areas. For example, our carbon-free electricity program's grown 18-fold since 2020. We have diverted waste on the order of 114,000 metric tons. A couple other things in here, and you can also check out our sustainability report. And to be clear, there's still a lot of work left to be done. Our emissions have increased 23% since our 2020 baseline, driven in large part by rapid AI growth and cloud expansion. And that means we do need to be incredibly focused on where our emissions are and what we can do to lower them. If you dig into those emissions numbers, 97% of that is from our Scope 3 footprint. Mm-hmm. This is our supply chain. It's manufacturing, it's construction, it's transportation. And this is where our big decarbonization hurdles remain. And it brings us squarely to this panel and this topic. The fuel that we use, that we burn to move our employees, to move our vendors, to move our products like Surface devices or Xboxes, to moving the things that we need to put into data centers, our racks and our servers, that creates a footprint, an emissions footprint from burning that fuel. So then what do we do about that? There's, to start with, always reducing your emissions through behavior change and through working with our suppliers to help them change what they're doing. It's, travel less, ship more efficiently, for sure. The other way that we think about it, what our team, my colleague Bella and I, Bella's here too, we focus on also building markets. And as we think about building markets, we look at it through this flywheel approach, where you have three core levers: demand, capital, and technology, where demand is really pulling forward the market by sending those signals, hey, we need more of this. You have capital that's coming in to build the supply, to invest in production, and then that creates more supply, more innovation. That gets people excited. You see more demand. You see investors then coming in, bringing more capital. And you have this flywheel effect that's wrapped by supportive policy, by great partnerships, by excellent talent, and an enabling ecosystem. So our team is focused on, as it relates to sustainable aviation fuel, both investment and procurement. On the investment side, we have a $1 billion fund, the Climate Innovation Fund. It was launched in 2020 alongside our corporate commitments. We've invested in, related to SAF, these three producers at the bottom: Dimensional, LanzaJet, and 12. We are also buying SAF, and more particularly SAF certificates. So you all have heard a bit in the panel here and before, this book and claim model for buying the environmental attributes associated with SAF. This is a really important tool for us because SAF is not available at every airport. And we want to be able to be capturing the desire of Microsoft and of other companies to buy and pay for that green premium associated with SAF. And if you're going to tag it onto a particular aircraft, that gets pretty tough. So the book and claim model separates the environmental attribute from the physical molecule and is tracked, verified, and certified so that we have confidence when we go to then retire that claim in our inventory or in our data fact sheet that you can see, that we get that environmental benefit. So we've been purchasing SAF since 2019. We've inked over 15 contracts around this, including a really important first of a kind long-term SAF agreement, SAF-C, SAF certificate agreement, in 2023 that was a 10-year offtake, which is really important to providing producers the confidence to go out and build, investors the confidence that this is a bankable project, that there's going to be people that want to buy what you're producing. So that was really big for our company. And then 2024 was the first year that we actually reported lower emissions from these SAF certificates in our inventory. We use something called management criteria we could get into, but this has been our journey around sustainable aviation fuel so far, and very excited to talk more about any other topic that we want on this. So
awesome.
Thank you.
And so, Tim, tell us about the efforts that you're leading to really take this to scale in the region.
Right. Thank you very much, Ross. Really glad to be with you all today. It really doesn't matter that I've been working in this industry a long time, but what this Cascadia thing is all about, it's about bringing the collective community together and addressing many of the systems issues that this industry faces that allow us not to scale. The industry and the sector is, as everybody's pointed out, one of the most difficult decarbonization tasks that we have to date to address. Cascadia is really focused on developing and building regional production that results in about 1 billion gallons to start with. And that comes from the ability that we have as a region. I mean, if you think about who we are as a region, this region is the center of aviation innovation with Boeing. There's no question about that. We have the most effective and sort of the most effective policy that the policymakers have laid down in Washington and Oregon, in particular British Columbia. That is a key component of the success. We wouldn't be in this room today talking about this really from a real substantive standpoint if it wasn't for the Climate Commitment Act and the Clean Fuel Standard and the tax incentive systems that are in place in Washington and British Columbia and in Oregon. And so really important to understand why we're here. And the goal of Cascadia is all about, sorry about it, I should advance my slides. There. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. Really what we are really all about here is focusing on de-risking the marketplace. If you think about all of the centers of risk associated with the aviation industry and particularly the aviation fuel sectors, it's not just finance, it's not just policy, it's not just offtake, but it's all of these things combined and about a dozen other issues associated with infrastructure, which was pointed out by Stephanie earlier, that this region faces significant infrastructure dilemmas associated with moving fuels that aren't fossil into airports, particularly SeaTac, our major airport in the region. Other airports don't face as many challenges as we do, but those are things that we have to deal with. The energy transition really requires a systems level approach I talked about, and these systems that are in place are really designed around fossil fuel deliveries and fossil fuel use. And what we're talking about here is developing an entirely new sector from different types of feedstocks, from fats, oils, and greases, waste materials, woody biomass, switchgrass, and other materials associated with ethanol, other materials associated with the energy sector that haven't traditionally been utilized, particularly by aviation. And so the entire supply chain really needs to be developed from the cradle to the grave. And the broader goal of our organization is both to address the systems issues on the accelerator side, but also to address some of the technical barriers we face as a region. We have an abundance of feedstocks that if we can unlock and unleash, we begin to address the issues associated with the cost of these fuels. And the availability of feedstock is the name of the game in energy, just like it is in crude oil. All of the major oil companies, their valuations are based on proven reserves, and proven reserves really is the balance sheet of any particular large energy corporation. And so feedstocks are an important element in driving the costs out of this business. And so some of the elements of the work we're trying to do at Cascadia is really address all of those barriers and all of those challenges associated with developing an entirely systems approach around sustainable aviation fuel. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the broader category of renewable fuels and how that plays an important role in sustainable aviation. When a typical HEFA facility produces material, for example, the folks in Montana Renewables, when they produce sustainable aviation fuel, before they get to sustainable aviation fuel, they're also producing renewable diesel. Renewable diesel is an invaluable commodity for heavy-duty decarbonization here in the region. We do not have enough of it. In fact, we have very small supplies of renewable diesel relative to other states, primarily because our Clean Fuels program is just getting underway. And some amendments that were made last year that will tighten up the standards significantly this year and years beyond. But the point is that buyers of fuels and sellers of fuels have an opportunity to not just sell aviation fuel to the marketplace, but also they need to find a place for their renewable diesel as well. And so the hedge against the price of renewable diesel against SAF is an important business and strategic element that we bring to the table. Understanding how these markets and systems work is important. We're very familiar with it couple of airlines that have been working on this topic, which is, do they have corporate customers in need of renewable diesel as well as sustainable aviation fuel to drive the cost out of the sustainable aviation fuel that they intend to purchase for their aircraft? And so thinking about these market conditions and these elements are really important, and building the entire ecosystem is also super essential to creating a profitable SAF facility or a renewable diesel facility. So the economic impacts are enormous to our region, and we have an opportunity in this region, particularly because of who we are. Washington is unique in that we are cut off from the national energy supply system of crude and supplies of other than by ship, through pipeline or through or supplies of finished fuels within the marketplace. And so we have to produce what we use here in this marketplace. And frankly, we need a lot more energy in the region than we are currently producing, and particularly of renewable energy and liquid renewable energy. So the opportunity is quite large for our region to think about the opportunity of the fastest path to decarbonization might exist directly through an existing refinery that is already there that wants to convert and produce renewable fuels. And it also exists it also is an opportunity for the entrepreneurs that we're seeing here in the room, bringing new technology, whether that be e-fuels or using Fischer-Tropsch like the folks at Sky. The WSU did some work on sort of the economic potential here, and they think it's around a 13x multiplier for the region, which is pretty substantial. And the overall opportunity around CO2 emissions of reaching that 1 billion gallons is about 7.5 million metric tons abated if we move to SAF. And so $500 billion of annual total economic impact, and the opportunity for saving jobs, creating jobs, and really building a strong ecosystem of renewables here in the region that benefits all of Cascadia is really what we're all about. Thanks.
Thank you. So, great opening remarks. I want to follow up on that issue of driving down costs, dealing with the issues of bankability, and really, bringing this industry to scale. And just, Tim drove on that hard. I think all of you touched on that, but just any of you additional thoughts on really what's going to be needed, the next steps to bring the industry to scale. Andy's ready to go.
Go for it. I think so. The big barrier is making the $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion investment to actually build the SAF facility. You think about the oil industry, they built these things 50, 60 years ago. They're all fully depreciated. We're starting from scratch. And so when you think about building all of that infrastructure from scratch now, there's a lot of risk. And so the challenge to scalability is about who's going to take that risk, how do you share that risk, how can government play in helping to bring down some of the risk by having good policies like Washington has done and the federal government has done as well. So I think that's the biggest obstacle is how do you figure out the risk analysis? So, investors or banks that are going to loan money to a producer or invest money, they don't want to take all the risk because they're putting out billions of dollars. So, you go to the airlines and say, well, why don't you take the risk? Well, they say, well, we'll take some risk, but, and it's just about how do you figure that out? And I think the answer is going to be a little bit from everybody, and everybody's got to share in that risk. And I appreciate, and I think the other thing it's going to take is some broad thinkers, because I had one airline say to me, we love the project, but we'll just buy it. We'll buy the SAF. We'll commit after you've built it. Like we can't commit to 10 years. We'll just, why don't you follow up when you can do shorter term agreements? And of course, there is no project. if nobody does a 10-year offtake. And so it's how do you get in front of that? And when you have companies like Microsoft, you have companies like Boeing who are taking this broader outlook and say, hey, we actually want to be the catalyst to help make this happen. So we'll take a little more risk. You have some airlines that are a little bit broader thing and say, we'll take a little bit of this risk. And you have great investors and to say, we'll take a little bit of risk. But anyway, that's the answer. It's a tough puzzle to put together, but to me, that's the biggest obstacle.
Dick? I would really echo, and I did it again. I would really echo and agree with much of what Andy said there. A couple of interesting other observations, though. You know, as you focus on market adoption, you need to see that there's a market for the product. And what we've observed at 12 is that there really is no dismantling or lessening of the market's appetite for SAF. If you have SAF today, if you have a tank full of SAF, you're not going to have any trouble finding somebody to buy it. There's a lot of companies anxious to buy your product. Obviously, there's a price point conversation that has to happen, but there's a lot of appetite to acquire SAF, which is why we're seeing, you know, such an appetite to contract for us even before we make the product. But as Andy was saying, you know, getting that capital is a big deal and it's really hard. And threading that needle requires consistency of policy and incentives. Much of my work is focused on trying to get, you know, the different states to adopt the same definition for SAF because they don't all want to do that, and trying to get them all to have continuity of SAF levels because they don't all want to do that. Meanwhile, what's interesting is that while we've seen a number of states, and Washington's really at the forefront providing leadership around state incentives, you know, the federal government's been a little bit schizophrenic of late around, you know, just how much they want to provide in the way of policy certainty at the federal level. Not true overseas, not true in Europe. And we are at a risk of kind of falling behind and letting other larger, you know, governmental agencies and organizations assume a role of leadership here. So there's an opportunity for us to reassert ourselves. And I'm optimistic we're going to see that fairly soon, probably in the next Congress.
We really have to focus on production in the region. If we aren't producing in this region, as I explained, the marketplace that we live in, we are in a balanced marketplace. We don't have access to pipeline materials that come in from other parts of the oil producing parts of the United States. And so this region is really uniquely focused on the need for production. And so we're going to drive the cost out of this business through addressing the entire value chain. One is feedstocks. Two is costs associated with the production process. That's technology. That's Washington State. That's why they're at the table and so important. And it's the downstream pieces as well. Stephanie mentioned the equal access to the airport for alternative fuels. Highly important issue and a very significant, serious cost issue. And remember that our pipeline that exists that moves fuels from the northern part of the state all the way down to Portland and into the middle of Oregon is pretty much at capacity. And so we have to find other ways into airports that are very efficient delivery systems. And so we have to work on the entire value chain, and there's no way around that. So technology is part of the solution, feedstock's part of the solution, but the value chain is a serious component that we have to focus on.
Let me shift gears. As I said, you know, I come changing hats. I come from the environmental NGO community, used to be vice president of Sierra Club. My peeps aren't into you. We've come a long ways from the days of the inconvenient truth where people were excited to, you know, see a truck going down the road that smelled like peanuts. And now, you know, there have been some really well-publicized false steps with palm oil and other things like that. And so there's a lot of folks in the environmental community who've gone from biofuels are good to biofuels are bad. And so I spend a lot of time in my world just trying to convince people that fuels are on a spectrum and that these fuels can be produced well, they can be produced badly. How do we address the public skepticism about biofuels and SAFs? And how do we ensure that sustainable fuels actually, it isn't just a label, that they're actually meeting sustainability criteria, that they're addressing environmental justice criteria, and also addressing the local issues that need to be addressed?
Maybe I'll start, and then if anyone has anything to add, especially producers, that could be interesting. But yep, I'm on. Can you all hear me? Yep. Okay. From an airline perspective, that's also a huge concern. We don't want to have people have greenwashing claims around us. We want to make sure that we are actually reducing our emissions by using SAF that is truly creating a positive impact. And so we've put criteria in place before we purchase SAF to make sure that we're vetting the producers and the products and that it's actually a more sustainable, efficient product. First and foremost, all SAF needs to be certified. So we didn't talk a lot about some of the certification bodies, but that's another piece of this ecosystem. And so there's bodies like ISCC and RSB. If you're a producer, please make sure that you're working with those types of organizations because it's incredibly important that the SAF is certified. We have feedstock criteria in place, so we absolutely will not buy any type of SAF that has palm oil or soy in the product. And then we work really closely with players in the industry, like corporate customers, to understand what it is what they would need, what does SABA recommend to make sure that we're hitting that criteria. But this is of utmost concern for us. The other thing I would say is that we have to start somewhere. And so maybe we are not perfect today, but let's not let perfect ruin the industry. Let's start with a 50 or 60% product that is reducing emissions by that much, and let's work to get to 80 to 90 to 100% emissions reductions. But if we don't start somewhere, then we're never going to make our 2050 goals.
I'll just add to that. Great comments. I think about it in terms of transparency and partnerships. When it comes to transparency, it's around that whole book and claim model, tracking verification, third-party verification, registries and certificates to ensure that you have full confidence in what you're buying, whether it's a certificate or SAF directly. And transparency in terms of what Microsoft is buying and what our selection criteria are, our production criteria. And we do a lot of that work in partnership with really high integrity organizations like RMI to clarify what we're looking for and for it to be public so that, we can learn as we need to, where things need to get better. And this is an approach Microsoft takes across all the different types of credits that we purchase, from carbon removal to SAF certificates to EACs that are a version of all of this for low carbon materials like steel and cement. So it's just across the board really important to be transparent and to be working in partnership where there aren't clear standards all the time everywhere.
This is, I think, a question that's really important to SkyNRG and particularly to the founders of our company to make sure that we're doing this for the right reasons, that we're actually accomplishing the goals, but also from a business perspective that we're giving confidence to people who may be buying the fuel. So we have an independent sustainability board that these are environmental leaders from all over the world that meet quarterly and evaluate our feedstock choices and evaluate basically all of the things that we're doing. So then when somebody asks us that question, we can say, we get this independently validated. We're a B Corp, so it's another kind of certification that's looking at some of the things that we're doing. So, I mean, hopefully it's legit, but it has to be transparent as well. The other thing, though, I say to my environmental friends, I'm an environmentalist, but my environmental friends who are skeptics of SAF, is to say one of the things, especially in this moment in time, that's really important is this is one of the few climate policies where we can make a lot of progress, even with a federal government that may not be as excited about fighting climate change. And the reason is that this is an incredibly bipartisan issue because, and you can, people have heard me say this before, but this is a bobblehead issue. People just nod when you start talking about sustainable aviation fuel because it works for climate, obviously, it works for air quality, but it also works for jobs and rural economic development. It works for energy security. And so I say, environmental community, let's go all in, especially now, because we can make so much progress no matter what the political situation is.
Well, folks who know me know that I can love the sound of my own voice, and I could ask questions and keep going all time. But we did promise to have time for audience questions. So if anyone has hands, I'll watch for them. Otherwise, I can keep asking questions for a little bit longer. Seen any hands? Good. Kathy.
Yeah, so the speakers have touched on this a little bit indirectly with the comments about palm oil and all of that, but how much does the feedstock matter here, and how robust are the life cycle analyses really looking into what does it matter what we start with?
Why don't I start with that? And it really matters. Feedstock waste material is the lowest carbon intensity material you can find. Obviously, a clean electron would be very clean. But the point is that we have very robust accounting systems associated with our understanding of what the carbon intensity of these feedstocks are and how they are impacted in the refining systems. The example is the GREET model that was created by the Department of Energy in 1972, and it's in use by almost every Western nation in the world today as the sort of the gold standard of carbon accounting. And so we have and the folks at Argonne National Laboratory, Dr. Wang, who invented that strategy and technology, has known him for a long time. And I can just say that, the work done there is done on a regular basis and updated on a regular interval. So GREET is constantly being innovated upon and becoming more and more and more accurate. So there are a number of models out there. There's indirect land use. There's these other factors associated with the carbon accounting. There's a lot of discussion around indirect land use today. This is not going to be an indirect land use pitch. I'm not going to get into that, but it's very controversial. So the point is that we have an abundance of criteria and science associated with carbon intensity and sustainability factors associated with renewable fuels. And probably one of the most looked upon industries in the sector is that industry.
Anyone else?
I mean,
Other questions?
Yeah, it matters.
I got Darren.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. I'll go fast. Darren McGee, Institute for Energy Studies at Western Washington University. Interested to follow on the LCA question and the clean electrons question, maybe a question for 12. Any thoughts on the source of those electrons for those Midwest plants? A lot of great electrons from hydropower in Washington State, less so maybe in South Dakota, North Dakota. What can you tell us about that so far?
It's interesting where we go evaluating sites. When we try to evaluate, a potential site for a project, we kind of look to three rings of criteria and try to find a concentric balance point of, availability of CO2 at a good price, availability of electricity at a good price, and proximity of offtake. And on the electricity piece, and I think everybody in this room kind of knows this, the big takers for electricity are on the east and west coast. The generators of renewable electricity are kind of in the center, which is very unfortunate because then you got transportation, you got transmission cost factors that go into all of this. But we do find the most attractive area for our ability to acquire, affordable renewable electricity is kind of in that grain belt area. But, the spirit of your question is, at this point, I think, tied to the fact that there's also a lot of data centers that are competing. And when we approach a jurisdiction and talk to them about, hey, we've got this really cool technology and we're ready to spend $1 billion and we just need like renewable electricity at 4 or 5 cents per kilowatt hour, that's all. They are actually willing to talk to us at this point if you're not a data center, because the data centers are really creating practical development problems and are getting in the way of any kind of real diverse development of projects, and ours fits in pretty nicely with that. I hope I'm being responsive to your question, but I think what we're really running up against is the need to have a blending of in front of the meter and behind the meter. So a big part of what we're having to lean into is discussions about, okay, what is the fuel mix of the grid power, and what will be the cost pressure of us doing a significant amount of generation for our PTL, solution, calling on behind the meter power, and what does that all look like when you get to price? And by the way, not to over answer here, but another piece of trying to get successful in scaling is really about trying to find a solution to the price pressure that comes with going all the way to scale and doing a lot of behind the meter generation for our business.
Yeah, I'm Ariel from BP. My question is bringing us back to feedstock for a bit. Don't need to go into the ILUC conversations, but it's kind of in the same trend. So feedstock availability was mentioned as a big gap or a big constraint, as well as a key impact to our transition to net zero through biofuels and through SAF. Ag feedstocks in the US are the incremental feedstock to our market. Many ag feeds are being produced in a more sustainable way, new farming practices, lots of different technology improvements there, and with new options such as cover crops and different novel seeds. So how do each of you see ag feedstocks and ag-based SAF playing a role in the transition when there's a big gap in production to the global ambitions?
I'll start. I think ag feedstocks are an essential component to the mix of feedstocks that we use. There's been tremendous progress made on farming practices and other things associated with farming that have reduced the carbon intensity of their process substantially. One only needs to look at the pathways filed by agriculture producers of ethanol and biodiesel in the state of California, where you see a 30% and 31% decrease in the carbon intensity of those feedstocks associated with those processes. And that's a direct result of the policy that's in place in California. So we think agricultural feedstocks, or I do anyways, ag feedstocks are an important part of the component.
Yeah, we also think they're an important part of the component. Important component. I think that going back to maybe they're not perfect comment, we can start there. You saw on Jason's slide, I believe it was, there's a ton of HEFA production and plants planned. That will likely be agricultural feedstocks that go there, but there are more lower CI options available. And so getting the industry to move to lower CI options as we evolve will be a key goal of Qantas. But starting with what's available and making that as efficient as possible is a secondary goal as well.
Just one quick point to add. When you think about ag feedstocks, I think, and maybe hearing your question, I think many people would think of crops, canola and everything, but also remember that renewable natural gas from a dairy or swine digester is also an agricultural waste product, and is definitely a great way to make SAF.
I think we have time for one more audience question.
Hi, good afternoon. Stephanie Self at the Washington State Department of Commerce. This question came up for me in the first panel, but I thought it might be interesting to ask it to this one. I was interested in the information about the big gaps between announced capacity and actual delivered SAF. And I imagine there's many, but I was wondering if any of you would like to speak to what you see as the biggest causes of that gap.
I think it's the financial risk that the industry faces associated with investments, and the availability of capital associated with that risk is number one. I think the lack of durability at the federal level and their policy structure has been a major disincentive, particularly to Wall Street's interest in participating, particularly in the nth plant. I see that as a substantial barrier. However, the West Coast has played a significant role in sort of preventing that from being the case here. However, I also see the other challenges associated with feedstock and reliability of various sources for feed to your facility as another pretty hefty risk associated with those investments.
Last question, John.
My name is John Pierce. It's part question, part comment. The comment is, having done a lot of work in Australia, Northwest Shelf, Woodside, all that, and with Fortescue, that's some of the cheapest electrons going, and it has a huge capacity, just empty space, lots of sun, and could be built on the backbone of the LNG infrastructure that's already there. And the US and the Australian defense is tied with Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, and all that in terms of defense fuels. I'm wondering if Qantas, I'm assuming you're nodding your head, you might have looked at that, and it's a destination we're looking at it to put e-fuel facilities there now.
Yes, it's a great place for e-fuel facilities. You should be up here. Also touting Australia's opportunity. But yes, there are not a lot of production facilities today. It is a key goal of ours to grow that. And e-fuels, it's a perfect market for that.
Well, the pricing was less than $1 per kilowatt hour. I mean, you can't get that cheap here.
Yep.
All right. So like the last panel, I'm going to ask everyone to do one key action-oriented takeaway you want everyone to leave the room with, be doing to make SAF scale in the region. I'm going to mix things up though, rather than just starting at one end. I'm going to start at the middle. So Lauren.
All right. Well, in the spirit of January and failed New Year's resolutions, I'm going to make this very digestible and easy. Is just check out, see if your company has a net zero commitment. And if you have business travel, can you buy Scope 3 SAF certificates for that? They're available. It's a solution available on the market today. And you can purchase them. So just start there. I mean, I want to send you home with the biggest vision possible. And also, like in the spirit of Courtney, start somewhere and see if you can get some yourself.
Right. Derek.
We need to remain focused and vigilant on policy, including at the state level. Notwithstanding my point that we need consistency and clarity throughout the country, to some degree, we need to look at policy as a bit of a work in progress and keep the conversation going between the producers and the policymakers, because I think we're all on the same side here. We're trying to get to commercialization and get to scale to prove to the world that this can be done at an affordable, successful level to answer the call of decarbonization for aviation and to keep the Pacific Northwest in a leadership role.
Courtney.
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I was also going to say policy, but I will mix it up a little bit and steal from Andy on the risk sharing. I think it includes policy, but any risk sharing mechanisms that can be put in place where airlines, banks, corporate customers, governments take a bit of that cost premium, SAF is 2 to 5 times more expensive. No one person within that pool can pay for that alone. And so putting together the right mix of risk sharing within those players plus others is key.
Andy, she stole your thing, so what are you gonna say?
Well, I'll go a little broader and just say, like, my call to action or takeaway is just like, don't accept the status quo. And if you believe aviation should be decarbonized, if you believe in SAF, like, just push wherever you can push. And it could be, as Lauren said, it could be pushing your employer, but it could be pushing your legislators, your state and federal legislators. It could be pushing, if you're in the SAF industry or in the aviation industry, making sure you're pushing yourself as far as you can go and pushing your company. This is a really young industry still, and it's going to need a lot more momentum and kind of energy from all of us to get off the ground.
Off the ground. Off the ground.
Tim, bat cleanup.
Yeah, we need to build production, and we need to do that by putting scaffolding around all the producers in the region who want to come here that meet our specifications and our sustainability objectives and make them successful. And that means the community that's here today. That means the broader community in the region. And that means everybody has a role to play, which is if there's a plant coming to your neighborhood, better figure out a way to help them succeed.
All right, huge thanks to our panel. And I'm going to welcome back our fearless leader, Eileen, for some closing remarks.
Thank you. Yeah, you guys can certainly sit down. Thank you all so very much for a very rich afternoon. Let's give all of our panelists another round of applause. As I'm sure you can see, a lot of work went into their preparation, and we are really grateful for it. Contributions from individuals and foundations are what make these events possible, so I would be remiss if I did not give each of you the opportunity to support CETI's work by using the QR code that's on the left-hand side of the slide. We also invite you to sign up for our mailing list so you can stay updated on all of our work with the QR code that's on the right side. Thank you again very much for everybody